Hello everyone and welcome to another in the webinar series hosted by the Australian Childhood Foundation. My name is Claudia O'Hara and I have the pleasure of bringing you through the wonderful world of sensory processing. Now, before we get into the content, I'd first of all like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians and owners of this land and waters, and here in the ACT, that is the Ngunnawal people. And we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to their children who are the leaders of tomorrow. We acknowledge that they have a living history and living culture and many thousands of years in which they have raised their children to be safe and strong. And take a moment to reflect on the fact that the meaning of the word Canberra, here we are in the ACT, and its original spelling actually means meeting place, which reflects the very importance of this area within Aboriginal culture. And so as such, I extend this acknowledgement of culture of country both to the Ngunnawal people, but also to the many clans who will have visited and travelled through the area for many, many, many years over time. So yes, I not extend that acknowledgement to all. As you're aware, this is part of a series of trauma-informed practice programs. That's not just comprised of the webinars, but there's many other components of that as well, which you'll obviously be informed about as time goes on. And I hope very much that you enjoy the program that has been put together and you find it valuable and useful in your roles as early educators. Okay, so sensory processing. Over the course of the next hour together, I'm hoping that what you'll take away from this is that you'll feel confident to be able to identify our sensory systems, have some understanding of what sensory processing is, and by extension, what sensory modulation is, as the two go very much hand in hand. To be able to reflect on and recognize some regulation and dysregulation from a sensory perspective. So in other webinars, this is very much talked about in terms of fight, flight and freeze arousal levels and how we see that in behavior. So what I'm hoping to bring with this webinar is the sensory lens to add to that and help not only inform and provide a bit more information about what might be causing the arousal levels to go up and down, but also how we can potentially use sensory input to support your co-regulation of that young person as and when it's needed. And through that as well, obviously, we talk about how this relates to your role as early childhood educators and how you can use sensory processing and sensory input in a way to really support the children that are in your care. So our sensory world. Now, as you'll be sitting here watching this webinar, you're inundated by many different sensory inputs. Your auditory system has been bombarded by the sound of my voice. You can hear the words that I'm creating, the tone of my voice going up and down. All of this is sensory input coming in through the ears. You've also got visual input through the screen that you're watching, the different colors. You can see the words, all of this input coming in through the eyes. But we also have a lot of other sensory input coming into us, even separate from this webinar. So thinking about where you're sitting, is your seat comfortable? Is it hard? Are you in a good position, or is your leg going a bit numb? You know, all of this sensory input is coming in from the side as well. Perhaps you're feeling a bit hot, perhaps you're feeling cold. You know, there's the temperature as well around you that influences how you may be feeling and how attentive you are as well to this webinar. So we cannot move around, we cannot function within our worlds without sensory input and without encountering sensory input basically 24/7. And our brain very much helps us to titrate that so we don't have to attend to and cognitively, consciously process every single piece of sensory input that comes in, as that would take up more brain power than we actually have, and we would never actually get anything done. So a lot of this stuff does happen on an unconscious level, and our body just takes care of it for us, which is really helpful. We also have lots of different preferences as well around what sensory input we enjoy, what we might avoid, and what we might seek out as well. So everyone's unique in that respect, and no two people will have the same sensory profile as the next. So I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind before we get into the detail of this content, is that when we're thinking about sensation, we need to really think about that as just a normal everyday experience. And we can use it to our advantage when we know a little bit more about it. But to have a sensory preference does not actually indicate that there's any underlying need. There's not any particular disorder associated with that. So I think quite often people only think about sensory issues or sensory needs for people and children who actually are quite kind of on the pointy end in terms of their sensory preferences. And there may be times when actually sensory input or the lack of sensory input can impede a person's participation in their daily activities. So it stops them doing the things that they need to do, that they want to do, or that they're expected to do on a day-to-day level. And when you come across someone like that, be it adult or child, then that's the sort of time when you might think, okay, maybe we'll need to refer this through to someone like an occupational therapist who will be able to work with that person and work with their family to be able to really understand what that sensory need is and how that can be modulated, how they can be supported to engage in the things that are going on in their everyday lives. But for most of us, in the majority of cases, the sensory preferences that we have, so separate from needs, the sensory preferences that we have will influence how we operate and how we move around the world, but are not necessarily stopping us from doing the things that we need and want to do. So think about it as, I guess, it's a continuum, just like many things in life. We have this continuum, and on one end, we have people that do need additional support to understand and monitor and support them to interact and participate in the world. But for the majority of us, actually, this is just our sensory preferences, and the more we know about it, the more we can use that for our advantage to be able to navigate and work within the world. So just bear that one in mind. It's not sensory information, and sensory processing is not just about disorders. Actually, the majority of us don't fall into that category. So what is sensory processing? Well, in a nutshell, our body receives sensory information through the nervous system. It goes from the nervous system up to the brain, where it is interpreted, and the brain decides how we respond to that, how we react to that sensory information. So, for example, the brain may think, oh, okay, or you might go and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and you reach out and grab the cup, and you reach out, and the sensory input from the cup is that it's extremely hot. Shoots through your nervous system from your fingers all the way up to your brain. Brain says, ouch, that's hot. You must leave loose of that, otherwise you're going to get harmed. So then the body responds by releasing the fingers. So in that way, our brain very quickly processes and responds to sensory information in that way. Similarly, you may go and be washing your hands in the sink, and the soap smells really nice, and you just take a moment to really breathe that in, and you get a sense of calm, and your body might release a few endorphins around that as well. So again, your brain's taken in that olfactory sense, it's processed it, it's identified it as safe, it's identified it as enjoyable and pleasurable. So we hang out and we do that a little bit more because it feels nice. So as I say, it comes through the skin. We have a lot of receptors all over our bodies through our skin that allows us to have tactile information, tactile sensory input coming in that way. Our eyes, obviously, and ears and mouth give us an awful lot of input. And we'll go into the senses themselves in a few more minutes, but there's quite a few that people are already aware of, the big five of sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. And yes, all of that is received through, sent up to the brain, processed, and then we respond. Now, how we respond to that may also be quite different depending on our life experiences. So for the children who may have been impacted by trauma in some way, their sensory processing may be slightly higher or slightly lower than a neurotypical child, for example. So certain sensations may be processed quite quickly as dangerous, for example, which other children may not process as dangerous. So thinking of a very general example is of someone wearing a red t-shirt. Now, as we know, and as you will know from other webinars that you've watched, that for traumatic instances, quite often there's a lot of gaps in the memory. The hippocampus just hasn't encoded and hasn't recorded that information in full detail. And so quite often it will take one element of that memory that can spark a fight, flight, or freeze response, a fear-based response. So for a young person who has experienced trauma, the sight of a person wearing a red t-shirt may be enough to send that body into arousal, because the stimulus is coming through the eyes, the brain's processed it, tagged it as dangerous, and then the body mobilizes to try and respond to that and keep the body safe. A neurotypical child who will not have had a similar experience will just see that as a person with a red t-shirt. Equally, that gets sent up to the brain. The brain acknowledges it as safe, no worries there, and the body continues and carries on as normal. So the influence of trauma and the influence of early life experiences can very much influence how sensory information is responded to by the brain. And this is very useful to know as well in terms of what preferences and what behaviors and what responses you see in the children in your care, because there may be a sensory element to that as well that you can either respond to or actually use again to try and help co-regulate that child. And we'll get into that a little bit further down the line, but just that's something to bear in mind, that as that information goes in, the same stimuli is going into both the neurotypical child and the child who's been impacted by trauma, but the brain is interpreting that signal very differently. And so the response to that information is very different as well. So just bear that in mind. Again, on very general levels, our sensory processing system allows us really to be focused. It helps us to maintain our attention. It helps us to interact with our environment. It helps us to regulate our emotions, and it really supports our ability to participate in the things that we need to do every day. Okay, so how many senses do we have? We actually have 8, as far as we're aware of. The big 5, as I spoke about before, are ones that people are generally quite familiar with: the sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. And quite often we have a bit of a play around with those things as well. If we eat something particularly hot and spicy, and that gives us a big response. So those are the 5 that people are most familiar with, but actually we have 8. And these 8 senses can be separated into 2 main categories. So the big 5 are classed specifically as far senses. So we think about them as far senses because they bring in sensory information from outside of our bodies. So everything that we hear, everything that we see, smell, taste, touch originates outside of our body, and it is through the sensory receptors, our external sensory receptors, that we actually bring that information in for processing by the brain. So they're called far senses because they're outside of ourselves. The proprioceptive, vestibular, and interoceptive sensory systems, however, are referred to as near senses. And that's because the sensory receptors for those senses are actually originating inside our bodies. So this is giving us all of the information that we need or that we can access from internally, what's going on inside. So to give you a bit more of a context or a bit more of a sense of that, I'll break these 3 down in a little bit more detail because these are the ones that people are less familiar with. So we'll start with vestibular. So the vestibular system primarily is located within our inner ear. And it helps us very much maintain our balance and our posture, and it helps us to really know where our heads are in the world. So if you think about, if you've ever been in the swimming pool and you've done a bit of a somersault, that is, the vestibular sense allows you to know when you're oriented up, when you're upside down, when you're back up again, and it helps you to orient where your head is to where the surface of the water is as well. So that very, very vital part of the inside of your ear actually helps provide all of that vestibular input to the brain for processing. And obviously, again, the brain will respond to that signal and help us to either regain balance if we go wobbly and fall off balance. It allows us to jump, it allows us to spin, swing, walk upstairs, stand on one leg. All of those sorts of things are all things we can do primarily because of our vestibular system. And you may ever, if you've ever experienced quite a nasty ear infection and your ear's kind of full of fluid and yuckiness, and that actually can interfere with that sensory system, because the input going into the vestibular system is slightly unusual because of all of the additional fluid in the ear, then that interrupts the signal that's sent to the brain. So we may actually be sat on very solid ground or stood on very solid ground, but because our inner ear is not calibrating that, it's not really picking that up in the right way, it's sending signals to the brain that may suggest, oh, we're not right, we're kind of wobbly right now. So the brain responds by saying, oh, okay, so we need to change our balance a little bit, and we need to account for this wobbliness, and that results in us feeling quite dizzy and quite off balance. And so many people will have had an experience in which their vestibular system, for one reason or another, has been slightly tampered with or interfered with. And then that has an influence on how stable we feel and how able we are, for example, to walk in a straight line, or feel like we're standing up and not kind of swaying from side to side. I guess another example is when you come off a boat. If you've been on a boat for a few hours and you come off and you're now walking on solid ground again, your vestibular system has been so used to accommodating for the rocking of the waves that when you come off, it takes a bit of time for it to adjust again. So you might feel like you're still rocking a little bit for maybe 20 minutes or so after you come off the boat. And that's, again, part of your vestibular system trying to keep you balanced and allowing you to function successfully and safely in the world. So the proprioceptive sense is very closely linked to the vestibular sense. It's also one that's very much body-based. We have receptors in our muscles and our tendons and our joints, which allow us to know where we are in the world. And it allows us to move freely without really consciously thinking about it at all. So, for example, I'm going to reach out, grab a glass of water, bring it back to my mouth, and take it back and put it down again. I can do all of that without having to shift my vision away to the glass, because my brain knows where my hands are. It knows roughly where the glass is. I can reach out and grab it. It has a bit of help from my visual system as well, but I'm able to bring it to my mouth without really thinking about it, and also to exert the right level of force on the glass. So I'm able to hold it safely without pressing on so hard that it might crack, or in fact not pressing on it hard enough and it may slip from my fingers. So the proprioceptive sense, again, helps us to really know how to interact with the world. And if you've ever felt a little bit clumsy and your spatial awareness has gone off, what you'll notice is you may bang into things a bit more. And again, you may see this sometimes in some of the children that you care for, that if they go through a bit of a growth spurt, they may get a bit clumsy for a while. And part of that is because their brain actually has to adjust their proprioceptive input a little bit, because things are not quite where they were just a short time ago. So it's kind of got to accommodate again for that change in the physiological makeup of the child, and then it recalibrates, and then all is well again. So those two systems work very much in tandem with each other. Oops, sorry, I slipped ahead a little bit too quickly there. And really help us to navigate the world. Now, the interoceptive sense, which is very much a new one, this has only recently been added to the list of senses, but I think it's an incredibly important one as well, because this really helps us to tune in to what's happening internally inside of our bodies. So we're talking about literally organ level kind of tuning into ourselves. So it helps us to know if we're feeling hungry. It helps us to identify thirst. It helps us to know if we're full, so we know to stop eating. And it also helps us to really recognize our arousal levels through the cues that we get internally as well. So the example in the table there is of when our heart is really racing and we can feel that pumping in our chest, and we're aware that it's faster than normal because we're actually aware of it now, whereas usually it just kind of pumps along quite nicely without really us noticing it at all. We may notice that our breathing has changed, that we're breathing more shallow rather than breathing very deeply from the bottom of our lungs. We may notice that we're actually clenching our hands, or that if we stay still, we can kind of feel a thrumming or a vibration through our body. So it's those real internal cues that the interoceptive sense is all about. And for children who've experienced trauma or traumatic experiences, quite often that interoceptive sense is a bit miscuing for them. So in some cases, the child may not actually be aware of those sensations at all, and they just haven't really had the opportunity to really tune into that, or they may not really be noticing that. And you may see that, especially in older children who may say that they get real angry real quick, and they just, 1 minute I was fine, and then the next minute, I flip my lid and I'm really, really, really angry. So I go like 0 to 100, because they kind of miss those internal cues that say you're starting to get angry, or you're starting to ramp up. Your blood's boiling a little bit, your heart's pounding a bit more. That they kind of miss those cues a little bit. In other cases, they may be aware of them, but they just don't know how to interpret them. They don't really understand what that means. Quite often, because of the impact of their traumatic experience, and just not having that link, that meaning making, nice and explicitly given to them in any way. And again, when we think about that, it's unfortunate for these children that has been their experiences, but this is also not, it's not the be all and end all. That this is something, especially with the age group that you guys are working with, this is something that can absolutely be supported to grow and develop. And that is, I see, as a big part of how this applies to your role as well. But again, jumping ahead of myself, so I'll hold on to that one till a little bit later. And what is also really important to remember about this sensory stuff, as I've said it before, is that everyone is very much an individual. That you have your own neurological thresholds, whether that's low or high, to how much sensory input comes in, how much you like something, how much you don't like something, how much you might seek something out or completely avoid it. And I've often seen that kind of mismatch sometimes between parents and carers and a young person or a child, where the child really wants to explore all the sticky, messy paint, slime, gooey stuff, and may like to kind of put it on their bodies as well, not just keep it on the paper. And the parent who may not like that sensory input quite so much may be quite horrified by that, and that's where sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch between parent, carer, and child as well, in terms of sensory preferences. But we all have our individual likes and dislikes, and the important thing really is to kind of be curious about it. And again, as I said before, there's no right or wrong around this, but it's also gives us an opportunity to say, oh, well, they really like doing this and I really like doing this, so maybe I'll be the adult that works with the child with the sticky, messy stuff, and you can be the adult that works with the child around the more dry kind of colouring in, or less sticky, messy tasks as well. So it's about actually using the strengths that you have. So I would recommend that as a staff team, you sit down together and have a bit of an explore about, your sensory preferences in terms of the work that you're doing with the children. And because there will be strengths within the staff team that will allow most people to do something that they love doing, and potentially letting other people off the hook from things that they dislike a little bit, and finding that balance between all of you to be able to meet the needs of the children. So we've talked a lot about sensory preferences, and so now we're going to move slightly to sensory modulation, which is how we respond to this sensory information. So in very general terms, it's about how we can grade our responses to make sure that we maintain a calm, alert state that allows us to participate in whatever task or activity that it is at hand. So we can use calming and alerting strategies to raise or lower our arousal levels to meet the need of the task at hand. So if you think a little bit about how you get yourself up and moving on a morning, you may come out of bed. If you're like me, morning's not the best time, so I kind of need a little bit of oomph to get up and go. Now, how do you actually do that for yourself? If that applies to you as well, how do you raise your arousal levels from that low, I've just got out of bed, I'd kind of like to stay in bed, but I can't kind of feeling, up to the point where you're calm and alert and ready for work? Now, perhaps you do that by having a shower, perhaps you exercise first thing in the morning, perhaps you have a coffee, all these different things that we automatically do or we naturally find ourselves doing to help raise our arousal levels ready for the day ahead. So if just spending a few minutes reflecting on that allows you to again really break down what are the sensory inputs that I'm seeking when I'm doing this. Now, how is it, what sensory systems am I using to ramp up my alertness levels and my energy levels ready for the day? And on the other end of the table, we've got winding down for sleep as well. So, conversely, how do we actually lower our arousal levels so that we've come home from a busy day at work, we've done the busyness of home life, we're now ready for bed. How do I actually grade my sensory modulation? How do I grade my arousal levels so that I'm ready for sleep? Perhaps I'll have a cup of cocoa, perhaps I meditate, perhaps we go for a gentle stroll, perhaps a bath. Everyone will have different strategies for that. And it's about tuning in to how you do that and learning about yourself, that helps you really understand what sensory systems you're using and how you're using them to your advantage to be able to make it through the day, without being too highly aroused or not aroused enough to be able to participate in those tasks. Now, in the same way, that children learn regulation, self-regulation for emotional things over time, and we'll have talked about that and seen that talked about in other webinars. The same applies here in terms of the child's capacity to learn how to modulate their own responses as well. So beginning with that attuned, real co-regulating responses of the adults around them, that helps them to really recognize and understand their own sensory needs and recognize and understand the things that help them to feel better if they feel distressed, or feel calmer if they're feeling over aroused, or feel more awake if they're actually under aroused. And it's important to remember that this is a skill. This is not something that children are born with. It's not something that just magically happens. This is a skill. It needs practice and it needs some element of teaching as well. And that's where the co-regulation comes in. And it needs a certain amount of brain capacity. So again, thinking about the cortical development of our young people, the children that you have in your rooms will not have the cortical capacity to really do that top-down processing and that top-down responding to their sensory inputs. So in the example that I gave you very early on about, if I feel really, my heart is racing, I'm feeling really anxious, I can use that top-down cortical way of self-talking myself, everything's fine, I'm not in danger, everything's safe, I'm going to take some deep breaths. All of these strategies that we use our brain to support ourselves, these young children just simply haven't had the life experience yet, or the potentially haven't been taught yet how to actually go about doing that. So they just have a real big feeling and they act on that real big feeling. So we, as the adults around them, it's our job to provide that scaffold to help them make some meaning of that, and also help them build that capacity to understand themselves, and therefore over time to be able to have capacity to actually look after and respond to themselves and know what they need in that certain situation, or even know what it is that kind of triggered them in the first place in that way. And that's again another big place where your role is incredibly important in terms of providing that scaffold for the young person. And you can do that in many different ways, and a lot of it is around having a bit of a shared language as well, which we'll get into as we go through to the next parts about regulation and dysregulation. But just to bring this small section to an end, kind of key messages around sensory processing is that we all have very different sensory preferences. We have sensory input coming in through 8 different systems that we know of, 24/7 a day, and we are modulating and responding to that to the best of our capacity. We'll seek or avoid sensations depending on our preferences, and that there is no right or wrong to this. It's only an issue if it's impacting your ability to participate in daily activities and participate in daily life. If it's not impacting, then it's not something that you need to worry about. It's not something that you need any specialist help for as well. It's not a disorder or a disability, but you can use this information very much to your advantage. Okay, so regulation. So you've come across regulation a little bit in other webinars as well, in terms of arousal levels being high and low and how that links to fight, flight, freeze. So this is a slightly different, I guess, layer to that. So in this case, we're talking very much about being regulated from a sensory point of view. And what we're talking about here is to be at the most appropriate level of arousal for the task or activity that we're participating in. And this applies to everyone in the room, children and adults alike. And regulation levels, this graph gives you a bit of an example of what regulation levels may look like across a typical day. And they naturally fluctuate up and down. But generally, if you're kind of somewhere close to or around that just right level, that suggests that you're at a calm, alert state that's enabling you to fully participate in whatever the task or activity is that's in front of you. So if you think about, for example, the task of watching a movie, we require a bit of a lower level of arousal for that, to allow us to sit nicely on the sofa or on the cushions or wherever we're sat, attend to the movie, follow the storyline, and maintain, I guess, that calm alert state for as long as the movie lasts for. Similarly, if we are going out for a disco or going ice skating or something that requires a bit more of a higher energy, we need a bit of a higher energy, level of arousal to maintain our body posture well, to be aware of our movements, and to not be just flailing around kind of out of control and not really aware of what's happening and potentially being unsafe in that situation as well. So moving up and down is absolutely important and perfectly normal on a day-to-day level in terms of what activities there are in front of you. So when we're thinking about regulation from a sensory perspective, different tasks require different levels. If you're at the optimal level for that task, then we say you are just right. You are in a calm, alert state that allows you to participate in that activity. And this can depend on many factors as well. Things like our feelings of safety can influence that, how well we are, if we're unwell, if we've slept, if we're full, if we're empty, if we're cold. All of this can impact upon our ability to be regulated, and also how we respond to that again. As I've said, so if you're feeling too cold, you may go and pop a jumper on so that you maintain the right level of warmth to help keep you attending and focused on the task at hand. And I've popped in this regulation scale here because I think this is quite a nice activity to do just within yourselves and within your staff team. And it's really simple to replicate as well. It only needs the 3 lines really, the high, just right, and low. And just have a go at tracking yourself across the day, and thinking about what activities were you doing, and was your arousal level at the right amount of kind of alertness? Were you in that calm alert state that allowed you to participate? Were you maybe a little bit lower in alertness for some tasks than perhaps would have been optimal? Were you slightly more highly aroused than you needed to be for other tasks? And how did that impact your ability to really take part? How did that influence how well and how energized and how well you were able to participate in that activity? So yes, have a go at that. And thinking as well about how did you raise your alertness levels? If, for example, there was a task in the afternoon that required a bit more of a higher level of energy, how did you bring yourself up to that? How did you bring yourself down again afterwards? And what sensory inputs, what sensory systems do you use to facilitate that? Now, remember, as I said before, children do not have the cortical capacity to be able to self-regulate. This is simply developmentally not a place where they are. And this is something that very much needs to be scaffolded and supported by the adults around them. And again, that's very developmentally appropriate as well. We wouldn't expect, a 2-year-old or 3-year-old to be able to make that meaning of, oh, I'm feeling really highly agitated at the moment. It's because little Johnny took my toy, and that's exactly why I threw this other toy back at him. They just don't have the ability to do that in the same way that adults do. So we really need to take on that role. We need to lend them our cortex to be able to help to co-regulate and also begin to set the foundations of meaning making around how their sensory signals and sensory inputs and their consequential behavior, how everything's linked together, and how we can look after ourselves to do that differently. So they learn self-regulation very much through others, through first of all external regulation and then co-regulation as part of that normal development cycle. And by providing that scaffold around the child, it really helps them understand in a safe way what they need to support themselves. So we don't want to necessarily do everything for them, and depending upon the developmental stage of the child as well, we can think about actually how do we frame that. So if we're still very much in an external regulatory state, then we generally will just do the things, and we're talking there primarily around infants and very young children, where we will just do those things that help them to be calm and settled. So you might rock the baby, sing to the baby might be hungry, for example. Whereas with a slightly older child who's in that co-regulatory phase of development, where that really helps to support them to develop their own capacity, where they're going to be having slightly more explicit conversations around what this might look like. And you can both do that by asking the child as well. I wonder, and I noticed that you're quite angry at the moment, that your heart's probably racing, and building those kind of connections into what they might be experiencing physically. I wonder what's happening now. I wonder what made you angry. And if the child struggles with that, you can give them some suggestions. Oh, I'm wondering if maybe it's this. And they can say yes or no. And then you can suggest, oh, I wonder what you need right now. What do you think would help you right now to feel better? And again, if the child's not quite at that stage where they can say, actually, I need a hug, or I just need to go and sit on the swing for a while, then maybe you make those suggestions for them as well. You look like you need a hug right now. I think that will help you to feel calm. So bringing that into the language and bringing that into your daily interactions with the children can really scaffold and support them in a developmentally appropriate way to help build those skills for later in life. And for more information on that, I really highly recommend watching Regulation in the Early Years webinar if you haven't already, because that covers this in much more detail than I have in this slide, and really hopefully will make, I guess, add a richness to how this whole process works. So we've talked about regulation. What's dysregulation? Well, in very simple terms, dysregulation is the opposite of regulation. So we are not at the optimal level of arousal to be able to engage in a task. That is, from a sensory perspective, that's what we're talking about. So this graph here demonstrates a person with a consistently low level of nervous system arousal across the day. So typically, if someone is very low in their arousal levels, you may see that them as tired, potentially a bit distracted, unable to really concentrate or participate. They may not have any motivation to participate in things. And for example, if you're trying to sit down and have a story time with the group of children, if there's a child there that has low levels of arousal, they may slouch on their peers or lean on their friends. They might actually fall asleep. They might be drifting off, looking out of the window. They just aren't really able to attend to the task because they're just not quite at that right level, optimal level of arousal for that. So I guess a good way to visualize that is to think of the last time you sat through a very long PowerPoint presentation or a very long training day. And no doubt you will have noticed your attention wandering off to different things. Perhaps you were thinking about what you would eat for dinner, or what chores you had to do, or maybe even daydreaming about a holiday you're going to have. So it really prevents us from fully engaging in the task at hand if we are too low in our arousal levels. And conversely, this graph shows us someone who has consistently high levels of nervous system arousal across the day. And so typically you might see, if a high level of arousal, you may see a child who is agitated, possibly moving around a lot, fidgeting, maybe talking more. And again, just like the last one, the last graph, not really able to participate in their daily tasks. So thinking again about story time, that child would more likely be potentially shouting out about the pictures that they see on the page, or wriggling and fidgeting, potentially annoying and pestering the other children around them because they're not sitting still. They may not even be able to remain on the mat or the carpet at all and actually get up and move around the room. So again, that child is not in a position to really engage nicely and in that real calm alert state that helps them to sit and participate and attend and follow the story. And the graph representing here, this poor chap, is someone who has constantly fluctuating levels of arousal across the day. So you can see that they pass through that just right stage, but they just don't stay there for any length of time. So this child, may particularly find it difficult to transition from one activity to another. And so potentially requires a lot of extra support and scaffolding around transitions, because actually changing their or modulating their arousal levels from high to low, or from a higher level activity to a lower level activity, they just don't manage that very well. So they really need a lot of help to do that. So again, a really good exercise to do would be to sit down as a staff team and kind of brainstorm a little bit about the children that come into your centre. Which children in there would you say are generally at a real good calm alert state most of the time? Do you notice anything that might particularly dysregulate a child, where they're particularly high or particularly low on a typical day? And thinking as well about the activities that you run. What sort of activities might a child not be able to participate in if they're at a too low or too high level of arousal? And what sensory inputs might be influencing their arousal state? What might be contributing to that shift straight through the just right part of the graph to either high or too low? So you can tell I've already been touching a little bit in terms of how this is important to your role, and how this is relevant to the children in your care. And really, what I want you to think about is that your main goal as an early childhood educator is to support the children in your room as much as you can, to remain in a calm, alert state, to be able to participate in and enjoy all of the activities of early childhood, and that you can use the sensory properties of the activities themselves and of the environment to be able to support that process. That ultimately your job is to provide that scaffold and help to co-regulate with children when they're finding it challenging to do so, and helping them to learn and recognize their own responses to sensory stimuli, and then how to modulate and respond in response to that. And really, I'm asking you to put on your detective hats to look for signals from the children. You know these kids, really well. They spend a lot of time with you in the centers. So you know a lot about what their sensory preferences may be without necessarily sitting down and doing a profile. That's not what we're asking you to do. It's asking you to use that knowledge, existing knowledge within the staff team, to be able to support children to participate fully. And in the process of that, again, I strongly recommend that you work in collaboration with the child's parents and carers, because there may be things that happen at home that work really well that you can replicate in the centre, and vice versa. You may stumble across or develop an approach for a young person that works super well, and you want to share that with the family as well, so they're able to replicate that at home. So having that real kind of shared approach to this sensory needs of the children, and how we support that. And again, consistency, as you'll have heard again through many of the other webinars, that consistency of approach will really support the embedding of that and help the child feel safe with that process. And again, that will also help it to be quite effective, or build the efficacy of those approaches. So when you're thinking about the room and the children that you have, particularly there are things you can do just within and embed within your daily activities and within the daily structure of the centre, that can really support most of the children in the room most of the time. So think particularly about routine and cueing. They are your absolute superpowers when it comes to supporting regulation, because it really reduces down the number of surprises that a child has to manage at any one time. So I want you just to think back to, a year ago when COVID first hit, and we received a million and one different messages about how we needed to be and act in the world because of the pandemic. It was stay at home, or now you can go out, but you can only meet in groups of 3. Now you can't, you can only be in home again. Even going shopping became really cognitively challenging because the staples that we would expect to be on the shelves just weren't there. If you wanted toilet paper or tin tomatoes, you were massively out of luck for a good period of time because they just weren't there on the shelves. There were restrictions around how many of anything we could buy. So our lives became cognitively a lot more challenging. Many things that we would have done without really having to attend to it, all of a sudden we had to think about, we had to plan differently, we had to think of plan Bs for a lot of different things. And that increases the level of cognitive load, that increases levels of stress, and no doubt will have led to a few more lid flipping moments than potentially would have happened otherwise. So think about it in terms of how that situation impacted you, and then apply that onto the children in your room. If you can give them some real consistency and real routine to their day, that can really help them to feel safe and secure in your space, which means that when something happens that is slightly out of the ordinary, you're going to have a response to that, but it's not one that potentially will top them out of the end, bring them out of the top of their window of tolerance and cause meltdowns or cause that lid flipping moments. And use as many different cues as you possibly can. If you can use multi-sensory cues, that's ideal. So for example, you may have a dinner bell or a dinner song, or something that actually the children can get involved with, that can help them to know, oh, okay, when this sound rings or when that bell rings, I know that it's time for us to start getting ready to wash our hands and go and have some lunch. And that by using multisensory or multifaceted approaches like that, you're also helping any children in your room who may have any language delays or whose English may not be their first language. And so this helps them also participate in the daily routines of the centre, because they can pretty much understand and can be helped to understand what that means. The bell rings, okay, I see everyone's now going and washing hands. This means it's getting time for dinner. So it helps children just to really have all of the routines explicit. And absolutely, you run very, very good centers in which there will absolutely be routines embedded in daily practice. But just think about, just because you know what those routines are, do the children? Are they explicitly aware of what that is? When they come in on a morning, is there a way for them to check which members of staff are in, for example? Do you have pictures up on the wall of who's in today that helps the children to ground themselves and go, okay, educator A, B, and C are in today, so that's good because I like them. Or, when they first come into the centre, is there a nice transitionary activity that they can get involved with that helps them to ground themselves in that centre before kicking off and starting off into the day? How do you bring the children in from playtime to lunchtime and then to nap time, for example? What does that look like? How do you grade and modulate their sensory arousal levels so that you're bringing them to a point where actually sleep is something that they find easy to do, because their arousal levels are ready for that now, and they're not still up high where they would have been out playing. So again, just think about what you're already doing in the center. Think about how you can use sensation and sensory input just to kind of help to build upon and strengthen those routines and cues that you may already have in place. So these are strategies to think about for whole center, whole cohort, children groups within your center, and how you can use this stuff to really help the children in your room to be nicely regulated most of the time. Obviously, again, not forgetting that they're tiny little people who will have meltdowns, and there's things that we can't avoid. This will just help us to have a few tools in our skills in our belt to be able to help to regulate and modulate the children on most occasions. For children who you're feeling a little bit more, they're on your radar for one reason, they're a little, maybe you're a bit concerned about them, or you're not sure if their sensory preferences are actually sensory needs, I would encourage you to again have a chat with their parent or carer. Is this something that they have noticed at home as well? Is this happening in other environments? What you're seeing in the room, and think about, what is the child doing? And when I'm saying that, I'm asking you really to kind of break that down and have a bit of a task analysis. So, if, for example, a child is struggling around hand washing, perhaps they're taking 10 minutes in the bathroom hand washing before lunch all the time, and it's kind of slowing things down. They're not getting to the table in good time to sit down with the rest of the children for their lunch. What's going on for that child at that point? And break it down. It's not just, oh, go into the bathroom, wash hands, come out. Break it down into its discrete little components. So first of all, entering the bathroom, excuse me, there's a lot of sensory stimulation in the bathroom. Sound echoes a little bit differently. The light is often quite bright. Is there something about the environment of the bathroom that the child is particularly drawn to, that they like to be in that space? So that entering the bathroom, which sink do they choose? Do they always go to the same one? Do they not mind which sink they use? How long do they run the water for? Do they like it hot? Do they like it cold? Do they hold their hands underneath the water for long periods of time? How long do they spend time actually washing with the soap? Because perhaps there's the sensation or the feel of the soap on their hands is actually helping them to feel nice and calm and regulated, and they really enjoy it, or the smell's really nice. And so that's holding them up for the length of time. So, and then obviously drying hands as well in terms of the towel. Do they use a hand towel? Do they use a dryer? How does that work in your setting? And what is it that the child is spending most time doing? What is it about that thing that you think they're enjoying, or what sensory input might they be seeking or avoiding in that situation? So it's really about breaking, and you could break that down even further if you needed to, but that kind of gives you an example of how a task can be broken down to really try and zone in on the parts that are particularly relevant to that child, and then looking at the sensory input that's going on. And that can help you understand perhaps what the child is enjoying or seeking or avoiding in that space. And also, looking for things that you can't see. It's not just what you can see, it's also what you can't. As with many things, it's just the tip of the iceberg is the behavior that you see on the surface. So perhaps the child is particularly tired. Maybe they didn't sleep very well last night. Maybe they're sick. Maybe there are other factors that are influencing what's going on when they're doing this task or activity as well. And that's why it's really important to do this in collaboration with the staff team and in collaboration with their parents or carers, because you really, they have more pieces of the puzzle, and the more parts of the puzzle you can put together, then the clearer that picture and that clearer that understanding is going to be. And as I was saying before, if you really are concerned about that young person, if whatever is going on for them is actually preventing them from engaging or participating in their activities, then that is definitely a time to talk to parents and carers about referring on to specialist services, such as occupational therapists, who can go through and do a profile or do some sort of assessment around that and identify how best to support that young person to participate in their daily activities as well. So we're not expecting you to become experts overnight at all. This is again about building your knowledge and building your skills about not only how you can use sensation to support the children in your rooms and in your care, but also when is the appropriate time to pass that on to someone who is a specialist in the field. And again, as a general rule, these are kind of this has come out of some work by Tina Champagne, who is an occupational therapist herself, who is very extensively experienced in the realm of sensory processing and sensory modulation. And if you are interested in this as a topic, I strongly suggest you look her up and look up some of the work that she's done. She's published some very interesting works around sensory modulation. So this has come out of her work, and it's basically giving us a bit of a framework around how we can organize and develop calming and alerting activities. So if the thing is that you need to raise the children's alertness levels, for example, after afternoon nap, to get them ready for the activities that afternoon, you want to think about an alerting activity that is potentially fast paced, has a bit of an uneven beat to it, unpredictable, So their brains have to really try and kind of speed up and catch up as well. So something like, I think that I saw a wonderful game in one of the early education centres I've been in recently, where the educators were just basically shouting out, stand up, lie down, turn around, and just, all of the children were absolutely fixed and engaged and taking part in this, and it's, really enjoying themselves as well, because they enjoyed that. It's kind of like Simon says, they enjoyed that element of sharing and an activity, and they enjoyed the element of unpredictability about that as well, and that was a really nice alerting activity for them. Similarly, if you're trying to calm a child down or calm the children down to get them ready for a more low level of arousal activity, perhaps some story time or lunch time, then the best way to do that is to use something really predictable, something that doesn't require a lot of cognitive effort on their behalf, that's familiar and fairly slow paced. So again, you're kind of bringing them to a point where you're modulating their arousal levels down. And really a big rule of thumb around this is to try to almost match where the child is, or where the children are, before you kind of try to bring them up or down. Because if they're quite low level of arousals and you come in really, really high, it's a bit of a mismatch, and vice versa. If they're really high and you're coming in too low, then again, there's a mismatch and it's not likely to be an effective strategy. So what you want to do is try and get in either just below if they're very highly aroused, or just above if they're at low levels of arousal, because then you can gradually bring those levels up or gradually bring those levels down, and the child will follow you. In the same way as that works with some of the other co-regulation strategies as well. So if you want it to be the most effective it can be, pitch it to where they are, and then move down or up as the situation requires. So again, you may use something like this as a transitional activity to move from one activity in the day to another, and support the children to do that effectively and smoothly. I'm going to show you a little video now, really that just encapsulates how easy it is to share language with the children that you're working with in a way that helps them to really get a hold of and grasp these very complicated topics, and also be able to apply them and use them as well. So obviously these children are slightly older than the ones in your center, but you guys are the ones setting the foundations for this, and it's just a really nice example. So I will let that play for you now.
I get really mad when my brother hits me a lot.
I don't like it when you say you don't want to play with me.
When I'm mad, my brain can get a headache and it can start hurting.
Your blood keeps pumping because you're really mad. And you start to get sweaty because you're getting really, really mad. And then when you start getting really mad, you turn red.
When your body can't really control yourself, mad just takes over your body.
I just get out of control. It's kind of like if you had a jar, and then the jar would be your brain, and then you put glitter in the jar, and that would be how you would feel like. If you shook up the jar and the glitter went everywhere, that would be how your mind looks. And it's like spinning around, and then you don't have any time to think. And you sometimes punch stuff and people when you don't really mean it.
When I get angry, I feel it in my heart.
I really don't like when I get angry. The amygdala really reacts, but the prefrontal cortex tries to keep it down.
When I feel like I want to, get really angry and yell, I just sometimes, take deep breaths.
First you find a place where you can be alone, then you find some way to relax and calm down.
When I need to calm down, I take deep breaths.
I breathe in through my nose. Sometimes I close my eyes or just take deep breaths.
It's coming down, it's like not like moving. It's like slowing down and then it stops. And the heart pumps slow and then it goes into your brain.
It's like all the sparkles are at the bottom of your brain.
My brain like slows down, and then like I feel more calm, and then I'm like ready to speak to that person.
Of how easily the young people can actually translate this knowledge and start to apply it to their daily lives, which is absolutely incredible. Okay, so I'm bringing you now to the end of our presentation. There we go, having a few difficulties of clicking along the slides, but we got there in the end. So what I want you to do now is sit down yourself or sit down with the staff team and think about how what are you already doing day to day in your centre that really involves and uses sensory processing and sensory inputs to be able to support routine and cueing and regulation for the children in your care. What do you think is working really well? What do you think you do best? And what things do you think you'd like to improve? And then try and again compare the two. Are there any strategies we can use from our best practice, from the things that work really well? How can we apply that to other areas? How can we build on that so that we're doing the best that we can be in providing that real trauma-informed response? And again, as I was saying before, collaborate as a team, collaborate with your parents and carers. The more information that you have, the easier that detective work becomes and the more effective the strategies are that you will develop. And if you are ever in doubt or you feel like there is a concern, then absolutely refer and seek specialist advice and guidance around how to support that young person. So that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. My name is Claudia O'Hara, as I said again, and I'd just like to extend some special thanks in terms of the information that was put together for this PowerPoint presentation. This was originally developed as part of a university project on one of my Master of Occupational Therapy placements, and my colleague Edwina Wong, who's a co-student of mine, and our clinical educator Kate Hilly of the University of Canberra. I just want to extend my thanks to them for their contribution to the information in this presentation. I hope very much that you found it useful, and I hope very much that you feel able to apply this to your daily lives. And thank you very much for watching.